everyone, and welcome back to World War One TV with me, Lucy Betteridge-Dyson, and of course Woody, who is still lurking around in the background. We love to have him here, not going to lie. I just want to start tonight's show by just saying a big thank you to everybody who's sort of supported us on this journey so far. We have reached our first round of targets, which is amazing. And yeah, just a massive thank you for me personally. I know Woody as well. But yeah, it's been so lovely, this little community that we're building. And tonight is the final show in this kind of first round of shows that we're doing. And as you guys know, the idea is that this is kind of an introductory like season of shows to kind of help you link the First and Second World War together if you're new to World War One. And tonight's topic, you can't get much bigger than this in terms of that. Treaty of Versailles is huge, complex. We could do easily a month's worth of shows just on this alone. But what we're going to try and do tonight is just kind of take you through some of the key points and discuss a few of the things out there about Versailles, because there's a lot of mistruths, there's a lot of opinions. You know, historians are still super divided on this topic. And there's no one better to take us on this little journey tonight than Mike Neiberg. Hello.
Hello there. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. I'm so glad you're here. And so glad we've got you talking about this topic, because even for me, you know, as somebody who studied the First World War quite extensively, this is it is big. I mean, it really is.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, the treaty itself was huge. And I feel like my struggle in kind of getting to grips with all the arguments, all the debates, all the things to think about in it, you know, is just as big as that, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult topic. I teach it a lot here at the Army War College. And I think every time I do, I find myself focusing on different themes, or I find the discussion going in a different direction. And as you said, it's because it was so big and touched so many different topics.
I guess the first thing to start with, and we can just dive straight in here because I feel like, you know, we've not got long and this is such a big thing. I want to kind of give as much info to our viewers as possible on this. And for people perhaps that are completely new to World War One, just in brief, what was the Treaty of Versailles? How did it come about?
Treaty of Versailles is one of actually 5 treaties that come out of the Paris Peace Conference, which runs from January 1919 to June of 1919. And the intent was quite literally to reshape a Europe, and by extension a world, that had been completely destroyed. And the way that I introduce this to students is to first show them a map of Europe in 1914, which I think Woody can pull up here quickly, and talk about the way in which Europe was organized into, back one please, there you go, into those 4 major empires: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. And the point that I simply make is from 1914 to 1918, really from about 1917 to 1918, not 1, not 2, not 3, but all 4 of those empires completely go away. And something has to fill that space. And the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference is an attempt to do that. And it's also an attempt to push against an alternative argument, which is coming from Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, about how this same space ought to be reorganized. So they are dealing with a lot in Paris in the first half of 1919. And the Treaty of Versailles is really the heart of it, is how to deal with the problem of Germany.
Sure. And I mean, I guess sort of coming off the back of that is everybody's got different ideas on how best to deal with it, right? This is not, you know, we've got, I guess, the 3 major players, Britain, France, and the US, and they all have different aims of what they want to come out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think is really critical to know is that there are at least 3, probably more, but 3 we should focus on here, ways that one could redraw this map. So Woody, if you could go ahead, 1, please. There is an argument, David Lloyd George calls it national self-determination, a phrase that often gets attributed to Wilson, but it's actually Lloyd George's. Wilson believes some of this, that if you could somehow take a map like this one, this is an ethnic map, if you could somehow draw lines around where Poles live, around where Ukrainians live, if you could somehow manage to do that, you could solve a lot of the problems of Europe. So I spend a lot of time with this map with students, the flaws in it, the difficulties in it, the limitations of it. Obviously, the tragedy of this map, if you examine it very closely, is that there is no Jewish identity on this map. So Jews end up almost completely out of this system, almost by design. So one way that you could redraw the boundaries of Europe is by ethnicity. Another way you could do it is by economics, that is, decide where major port cities, coal fields, iron ore mines should go. And a third way is based upon defense. It doesn't really make sense to draw boundaries of states that are either too small to defend themselves or have boundaries that are hard to defend. And what I try to talk with students about is that you take those three, and we're only going to talk about three here unless you want to talk about others, those three tend to run against one another. So, for example, if you create, even if you could draw a line around where Polish people live, it would not give them access to a coastal port. It would not give them defensible boundaries. So you can look at it as US, France, Britain, and certainly those countries each have their interests. You can also look at it as what are the ways in which you're going to pursue how you're going to make those interests a reality on a map like this one. And both of those things obviously come with tremendous contradictions and tremendous ways in which you can solve one part of that problem only to make another part of that problem worse.
Yeah, and I think, this is the key thing. Really, we speak a lot and we spend a lot of time and things talking about the effects of the treaty, but actually how the treaty was formed in the first place, that's something that we don't often talk about. And it's worth understanding that, because actually then you kind of have a better understanding or a better way to unpick the resultant conflicts that come off the back of it, because it wasn't, it wasn't the result wasn't something that everybody was happy with. I would argue actually probably no one was happy with all of it. It was one of those, wasn't it, really?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And there are some contextual factors to think about. One is that the negotiations to do this, of course, do not include Germany. They do not include the Russians. So two major players are going to be left out right from the beginning. And it should come as no surprise that these two pariah states figure out ways to work together in the 1920s and, of course, in the 1930s as well. There's also no necessary reason why it has to be a fixed treaty. In other words, one of the problems I think you get out of the Treaty of Versailles is you get a static document in a world that is incredibly dynamic. And the change just from the armistice in November 1918 to the opening of the Paris Peace Conference in January 1919, in just those couple of months, Europe and the world have undergone a tremendous shift. So I think there's a reason why the great statesmen of the world have never done this since. There's a reason why Harry Truman didn't want to do it after World War II, because you are using a treaty to fix a world in place that is in constant flux. And that's another problem that they're trying to deal with. The other thing I think that's probably worth doing is just a setup here. There are at least two fundamental questions here. And one is, what is the fundamental problem with Germany? There are people like Woodrow Wilson who argue that there's nothing wrong with Germany except that it was given a really awful government. Give it a democracy and it can be in the center of Europe and things will be fine. There are other people like David Lloyd George who are worried about balance of power. They don't want Germany to grow too big, but equally they don't want it to grow too small. They're not really worried about what form of government it has. And then there are people like Georges Clemenceau, Ferdinand Foch, and others who believe that the fundamental problem in Europe is Germany. It's too big. It comes from a different tradition than the other states of Europe. And that they never do really wrestle with how to deal with that fundamental disagreement about what was fundamentally the problem in relation to Germany. And of course, there are plenty of people who argue at Versailles that it isn't even Germany that was the problem in 1914. It was Russia and Austria. So, yeah, they're dealing with a lot.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that I think the thing I just picked up on there that I've never really thought about before is this idea of such a static agreement with really limited flexibility in it for a world that is in Europe anyway, that is complete disarray, and it almost seems the scope of what they were trying to achieve, like when you put it like that, there was no hope in that kind of being successful. But
I think you can do this if you sort of make a mental exercise in your head of what's going on, not just in Europe, but in the United States. So you have Gabriele D'Annunzio's excursion into Fiume. You have the Bolshevik Revolution ongoing. You have uncertainty in Hungary. You have revolutions on the streets in Germany. You have political riots on the streets in France. In the United States, the Republicans win the midterm elections, which means control of the Foreign Relations Committee is going to shift over to the Republican Party, which is going to make Wilson's job incredibly difficult. You have the Anglo-Irish Civil War that's getting started. You have a Rif War in Morocco that's getting started. And that's just the things that I can think of off the top of my head. The Greco-Turkish War, you could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
And so it is a world that I think by the time they get done with it, the document is just speaking to a world that is already vanished.
Yeah, and of course you mentioned, and we think about the Treaty of Versailles, and we just think sort of the Allies versus Germany. Like, where were Austria-Hungary in this?
Yeah, it's a separate. Those are separate documents that deal with separate treaties. There's a Treaty of Trianon, there's Treaty of Saint-Germain, and very famously a Treaty of Sèvres that tried to straighten things with the Ottoman Empire. That Kemal Ataturk deposed the Sultan and said, "We're not doing that." So there is a follow-on treaty that replaces the Treaty of Sèvres. So, yeah, it is a scary, dynamic world that Wilson, I think, especially the American president, is trying to deal with by a set of general principles that Georges Clemenceau and Lloyd George are just baffled by. That the same principle that you deal with Hungary is not the principle you're going to use to deal with Ataturk. It's just not going to work. And Wilson's of the opinion that these principles will work. So Germany is the problem that the Treaty of Versailles specifically is dealing with, but the Paris Peace Conference is dealing with much more.
Got you. Okay, so we've got a good bit of background there on kind of the context of where this was occurring at the time, and so the treaty itself, it's a very, very long document, right? What happens next? There's an agreement of some kind is made, between all these differing aims, trying to capture all of those. What happens?
Yeah, I joke with students. I read the Treaty of Versailles, so you don't have to. What it ends up producing is a different Europe that is both physically different in the way that the state boundaries are drawn. Some countries come onto the map for the first time, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. Some countries are reborn, Poland being probably the most famous example. Other countries are reduced in size, like Hungary. Some countries gain in size, Romania, and we can talk about each of these specific cases if you want. So one thing you get is a brand new drawing of the boundaries of Europe, which is something I think we should talk about because it's important. The other thing that you get are a series of compromises that everybody hopes will solve, at least in the near term, some of the problems that are dealt with. And I've articulated 3 of them here, and I'm happy to talk about any of those if you like. But it is an attempt after 6 months of negotiation to get something on paper. We should talk about Woodrow Wilson's fight with the United States Senate and why that doesn't work. But it is an attempt to get something in place before the world completely falls apart. And this is the physical map that gets produced as a result.
I mean, I think I'm just gonna leave it to you, Michael, just to go through it the way you think,
Sure.
best, because you're the expert on this, and it's such a big topic that me asking a bunch of questions,
Yeah. Well, let me go with a couple of them. The least controversial at the time, well, least controversial now, not the least controversial at the time, was the return of Alsace and Lorraine to France, which the French believe is an automatic, no question about it. We're not even going to have this discussion. There was an American group called the Inquiry, formed in the fall of 1917 to advise Wilson. It still operates under the name the Council of Foreign Relations, which is what it became in 1921. That group was not at all sure that Alsace and Lorraine should go back to France, that Alsatians were either an independent country or they were effectively German. There was another plan to kind of tie Alsace-Lorraine as an independent state with the Benelux countries as a kind of neutral, and the Rhineland, by the way, as an independent kind of shield between France and Germany. The French were perfectly well aware of this and made sure that French armies were sitting in Alsace-Lorraine. Here's a World War II connection for you. They created a riverine Rhine River flotilla commanded by a young naval officer named Jean-Francois Darlan, who later became one of the heads of the Vichy state in 1940. So France immediately took steps to say, Alsace-Lorraine is not even to be under discussion. This is ours. We're not going to discuss it. The Rhineland, that area in Germany west of the Rhine River, there were some in France who thought it should be annexed to France as compensation. That's an extreme position. The more common position was to say that it should become an independent country of its own. A young Rhenish politician named Konrad Adenauer played with this game with some French occupiers for a while. But the idea that gained the most popularity was to create it as an independent state and link it again with some subset of states, Belgium, Netherlands, something, again, to create a sort of buffer in between. The compromise they came to, David Lloyd George thought this idea was terrible because it would create, as he called it, an Alsace-Lorraine in reverse. It would just anger Germans the way the loss of Alsace and Lorraine had angered French people. So the notion was to demilitarize the Rhineland, meaning that the Germans could not put active duty troops there. They could not fortify it. They could not put air bases there, created as a kind of demilitarized strip. And as we know, that's a compromise that famously becomes a real thorn in the side of German nationalists in the 20s and 30s. The other very famous compromise is done in the East. It's obvious that if you create a Poland with no access to the sea, the German state can easily economically choke Poland and coerce Poland. This is something that the French in particular were opposed to because they have a vision of a strong Polish state on the other side of Germany. If you go to Warsaw today, you will see statues of both Georges Clemenceau and Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a young officer that went to Poland in the immediate post-war period. First time I went to Poland and I walked past it jet-lagged, I was really confused, but there is a statue of Charles de Gaulle right there in the center of Warsaw. And the very odd compromise they cut is to take the city of Danzig or Gdansk and to make it a free city governed by the League of Nations, of use to both Poland and Germany, even though it's unquestioned that the majority of people who live there are ethnically German. So those are three of the big compromises that are cut. We could talk about others. Putting Czechs and Slovaks together into one country is done to make sure that there's a big state in the center of Europe rather than two small ones. And something similar is done with Yugoslavia, the theory being that the smaller the state, the less capable it will be to contribute to what we would in the 21st century to contribute to collective defense, or I guess the army phrase would be to be an exporter of international security. If they're too small, they can't do that. So these are
jump in quickly. I said I wasn't going to say much, but
yeah, you're good.
It's, I hosted the show when Prit Buttar came on last week and talked about the formation of the Baltic states, and even during the 6 months of the Treaty of Versailles, things were changing on an almost minute-by-minute basis in Lithuania and Estonia and things like that. So keeping for the diplomats, the civil servants, and the politicians in Paris, trying to keep up with what was happening on the world stage must have been almost impossible. My question was actually going to be, was there any attempt by any of the nations to actually gauge public opinion about anything? I'm specifically talking about the people who live in the borders and areas and how they define themselves. People are talking already about Alsace and and that part of France and certain parts of was there any attempt to go out there and kind of get information, or was it all the decision making being done by those in charge?
Yeah, there's no doubt. So this is a map here that is an attempt to do that. This is a map done by the Inquiry, this American group. And this is an attempt to figure out who lives in the Austro-Hungarian Empire based on what language they speak. Now, there are hundreds of these maps. They are beautiful. They're hand-drawn. They're hand-colored. And all the data behind them is deeply flawed because the Austro-Hungarian Empire never had an incentive to take a census like this. So they're working off of very, very, very imperfect data. And they have these on, potash production, proximity to major rail lines. I mean, all kinds of data that they're trying to gather. So there are people who are attempting to do this. To me, the most fascinating source of this, there are two fascinating sources. For the interior, inside baseball, who's saying what to whom when, I think Lloyd George's Mistress and Private Secretary's diary is probably one of the better sources. But for trying to get a gauge of that larger picture you're talking about, the American senior military representative, Tasker Howard Bliss, left an incredible series of letters that he and his wife exchanged, where he is explaining to her, look, they're trying to carve up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is how they're trying to do it, and this is why it's never going to work. So there were people who recognized that it wasn't going to work. You can also sense that as March turned to April, they were getting to the point where they kind of said, look, we just have to make some decisions. We cannot go on forever trying to figure out what percentage of people in this particular province speak German and what percentage speak Polish. Right? We just can't do this forever because the data sets are too imperfect. And if I can throw in one more example of this, it was probably my favorite. I worked in the Inquiry's files for a while, and my favorite was a file where they were trying to figure out who the people were that lived in Alsace-Lorraine. And the only data set they had was a ethnographer in the 1890s. And this was his methodology. He literally walked through Alsace-Lorraine He would walk up to people and begin speaking to them in German. If they replied in German, he counted them as German. That was his methodology. And that's the only data set census that exists about who lives in Alsace-Lorraine. And anybody that's been there will know every Alsatian I've ever met can speak French, can speak Alsatian, and can speak German with some fluency. So the ability merely to speak German to a passing traveler is not a particularly good indication of what that person's ethnicity or self-identification might be.
Wow.
No, it's definitely not, in my experience. Certainly not there. A question as well that I'm just thinking of here is because there was an argument, right? You spoke about how obviously there's a view that the smaller the state, the easier it is to kind of control, or in some way it's less of a threat. And there was an argument that Germany be broken up even more. Who was making that argument? Who are the key players here? What are they after individually?
So there is a question about what to do with the German borders, but well, I shouldn't say that. There is an argument put out. It comes from the French military that if the Germans that one way you could do this, I'm trying to phrase this gently because it's a very controversial position that ends up going nowhere. The idea was what you could do is you could put most of the blame on Prussia. You could put the reparations, the guild clause, et cetera, onto Prussia. That would create Prussian resentment against, say, the Bavarians. Remember, Germany had only been a state for 40 years. It had only been a state for, 2 generations. So there was an idea that what you could do is mete out the punishment by where you thought the responsibility was greatest, which was Prussia, and kind of let the Bavarians off the hook, which, by the way, is what they do to Austria. So even though it is Austria that really is the one that lights this fuse in the summer of 1914, the Austrians get off with no war guilt and no reparations. So the idea is you could do this. Now, immediately, Lloyd George and Clemenceau don't want to do it that way. Then when there is a suspicion that you might present the terms of this treaty to the Germans and they might not sign, a real possibility, by the way, Foch and some of the French generals come back and say, well, look, if they won't sign, here's what we do. We invade, but we take the Bavarians as our allies, and we march a joint French-British-Bavarian army, and we march it into Prussia. And then we punish the Prussians. And of course, everybody says that's a ridiculous idea. We're not going to do that. So there are some ideas like that. There's nothing that I know of that would be the equivalent of the Morgenthau plan of World War II, where there really is a plan to pastoralize it, break it into the states. And of course, what they ended up doing after World War II is creating a federal system where power is really vested in the states. To the best of my knowledge, nobody seriously considered that as an option. What they did debate was where the exact borders ought to be. That debate was active.
Got you. There's a question that's come in here, Michael, from Peter. What was the balance between desire for retribution versus territorial, colonial, economic ambitions driving the negotiations? Just a little question there for you.
It's really, really difficult to see where that line is, right? Because I'm thinking of that line from Voltaire where it's impossible to talk a man out of something if his entire livelihood depends upon him believing it. So if you believe the Germans are evil, then you want to take their colonies away so you can make money off of them. But if you want to take their colonies away from them, you kind of have to believe that they're evil. So it's a kind of, circular logic that's playing in here. I think on the French side, the desire for retribution is clear, right? I mean, it's clear. In the French line of thinking, during this crisis in 1914, we proposed peace negotiations. We backed our soldiers off the frontier by 10 kilometers so there wouldn't be an accidental shooting or anything. You guys came through our territory. You destroyed the industrial heartland. When we did that to you in 1870, 1871, we paid reparations and we paid them on time. And that's what should happen here. And oh, by the way, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk shows what you were prepared to do to us. On the British side, I think it's a little bit more complicated. There were British leaders from Lloyd George on down who wanted to get Germany back on its feet as quickly as possible. So that they can become a trading partner again. John Maynard Keynes is in this camp. From the American perspective, the desire to break up colonial empires is far greater than bitterness at the Germans. There really is this American view that if you give them a democratic form of government, democracies don't begin offensive wars against their neighbor state. There really is this belief. It's an American belief that I think has endured all the way to the present day. I mean, when the United States went to war with Iraq, it was the same logic, right? We're not going to war against Iraqis. We're going to war against a bad government that's going to free them to do the things they should do anyway. So I think the mix is different in every person, but it's hard not to see that the retribution becomes a justification for what they want to do anyway, and vice versa.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say. I mean, we spoke about the legacies of the First World War in the US. This theme came through, this idea that democracy, self-determination equals stability, essentially, and that this was the kind of new the world dream, that Wilson had. And I guess the other thing to kind of come out that's kind of reflected to that in Versailles is the League of Nations, of course, as well.
Yeah. Before we get to that, though, there is a second part to Wilson that is also to that ideology. It is democracy and it is capitalism.
Yes.
It is global trade and it is linking the economies of the world, which means that empire has to be reduced or gone away. Because as long as the British and French imperial systems are in place, you don't have a truly free market economy. So if you look at if you read Wilson's 14 points, the freeing up of trade is as important to him as almost anything else. So that the core belief remains, and you see it in American foreign policy ever since in both parties. If we increase democracy worldwide and we increase trade worldwide, the incentives for peace grow and the incentives for war decline. And it's a core belief in the way the United States sees things. I think sometimes it works pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't work pretty well. But it is a core belief in the way that the United States is seeing the way Wilson wants to rebuild this shattered world that the First World War has destroyed.
And so, I mean, in terms of the US, I kind of want to dig into the impact of the treaty because I'm conscious of time. But just quickly, in terms of the US, what was Wilson's? I mean, were they happy with the treaty at the end? I mean, or not?
No. So the treaty, there are three groups in the United States. There is a group that is willing to accept the treaty. There is a group that's willing to accept the treaty if Wilson is willing to go back to the Europeans and get some revisions on certain clauses. And I can explain what those are. And then there's a fascinating group called the irreconcilables that just say, look, the fundamental basis of the treaty is wrong. And therefore, no matter what modifications you make to it, we're never going to sign it. And that group becomes known as the irreconcilables. And their argument is that the Treaty of Versailles is in fact unconstitutional because it could commit American military forces into a global conflict without the approval of the United States Senate. So on basis, it's unconstitutional. It's also unwise, they argued, because in the United Nations model, in the League of Nations model, it's one state, one vote. So there is no world in which a great rising power like the United States should voluntarily reduce itself to the power of the world's smallest state. And at the most extreme, they argued, it will be better for the world if the United States has a disproportionate voice in the way that it's governed. Because America's not asking for we're not asking for land, we're not asking for colonies, we're not asking for, again, you can agree or disagree, but this is what they were arguing. The group that was willing to go for some amendments said, look, if you put in there that the Senate has to approve deployment of American troops, if you put a carve out in there for the Monroe Doctrine, there's the great kind of big asterisk, right? And you do a couple other things like that, we might vote for it. I think it's probably true to say that Wilson could have gotten a pure majority to vote for the treaty. But the US Constitution, for whatever arcane reasons in the 18th century, said that it had to be 2/3 to get a treaty approved. And there was no way he was getting to 2/3. No way. So there are people that hated Wilson from the start. Henry Cabot Lodge, who happened to be chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who loathed Wilson with every fiber of his being. Theodore Roosevelt, who loathed Wilson with every fiber of his being, who just said, look, this is a dumb idea from the start. We're not going to sign it. We're not interested. We're out. And of course, the great difference for the United Nations is the creation of the Security Council veto votes, which makes the UN less controversial than the League of Nations was.
So, I think that is the kind of thing that we could spend a whole lot of time on, and I'm sure we're going to come.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of want to move on now, just because we are short of time, and I want to kind of ask you really to. This is the big one. This is the big question: is the impact of the treaty. I'm thinking the things that come to mind for me are this idea that it led to hyperinflation in Germany. That's the first thing. That the war guilt clause obviously was unjust. You mentioned earlier that it was Germany taking full responsibility for everything, as if nobody else was involved at all on terms of central powers, and this argument that was a catalyst for what developed later in Germany. Yeah. I'm just going to ask you, Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think there's two treaties of Versailles to think about. The one is the actual treaty that actually puts things in place like this map. And then there is the Treaty of Versailles as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the way the world was put back together. Any grievance that anybody had, you could call it the Treaty of Versailles. I would not be surprised if less than 1% of Europeans actually read that treaty and knew what was in it. And I think by the time you get to about the Ruhr crisis, 1921-22, there's almost nobody left in a position of authority in Europe who cared about the treaty, defended the treaty. Wilson was gone. Clemenceau was gone. Nobody cared about it. So in some ways, I think what the Treaty of Versailles becomes is a symbol against which onto which you can place any anxiety or dislike that you have about the world. And so I think there's about a 10-year period where nobody's really talking about the Treaty of Versailles. And then the Nazis are the ones who bring it back. And all of a sudden it comes back into vogue. In other words, what I'm suggesting is there is a way to run Europe by ignoring the Treaty of Versailles, which the Allies, to be fair, kind of do. They never do enforce all of the reparations. The war guilt clause is buried in there as Article 231, and nobody talks about it and nobody brings it up. There is a way in which you can run Europe without it. There is also the nature of the borders that get created here. So if you're Poland, those are pretty unfortunate borders that get created that are going to be really, really difficult to deal with. This map that I've blown by a couple of times here, if I can get back to it. The map on the left is Romania, with the red being ethnic Romanians or ethnic Hungarians as Romania defined it. The map on the right is ethnic Hungarians in Romania as the Hungarians defined it. In other words, the point is, what you can do is come out of the Treaty of Versailles and say, well, the reason that we don't control that area is because of what some idiots decided in 1919, it should be revised. It should be changed. And if it can't be changed peacefully, legally, whatever, then we'll change it by force. And the Anglo-Irish Civil War and the Russo-Polish War demonstrate that the system cannot necessarily prevent wars from happening. So what you really get, again, I think are two things. You get what the Treaty of Versailles actually creates, which are borders, a League of Nations that accomplished much more than often gets credit for, but was unable to do what it was fundamentally designed to do. I think you can make an argument that some of the economics, I'm not an economic specialist, but my friends who are, I think I'm of the point of view where I think the economic problems of the 20s and 30s were policy decisions blamed on the Treaty of Versailles more than they were the actual Treaty of Versailles. Like the hyperinflation in Germany, which was a conscious decision by the Germans to devalue their currency in order to pay off some debts that they had that included the Treaty of Versailles debts, but not exclusively. But I really think what's important about the Treaty of Versailles is that it becomes a symbol of people on the far left and the far right, and also becomes a symbol of a peace process that tried for a universalist attempt to solve Europe's problems and missed. Therefore, what do you do now? So if you're a statesman in the late 1920s and early 1930s, how do you fix the problem? And the answer is not, let's have another big international conference. The answer is, let's go back and find what's in the treaty that's really awful, and let's revise it. And that's what becomes known as appeasement, which is not a dirty word until Munich. Let's go back into that treaty, and let's see what we can reasonably change. So if I can go on for 2 more seconds, what does that mean? It means stop blaming Germany for the outbreak of the war, and let's go to this theory the side of everybody was responsible, which is equally not true, but it works politically. There are people, especially in Britain, that are talking about returning some German colonies. Tanzania is one that's always mentioned. There are talks about modifying the borders, giving Danzig to the Germans as long as they let the Poles use it, all this kind of stuff. That's initially what appeasement is intended to do. So when people ask me, did the Treaty of Versailles create the Second World War? My answer is no. It was possible to amend it de facto, if not de jure, and it was certainly possible to just ignore it. Nevertheless, it became a symbol of everything that was wrong, not just with the peace process, but with the war itself. And if I can do this real quick here, a couple of my favorite quotations. Harold Nicholson, the British diplomat, on the very first day of the Paris Peace Conference, bought a notebook and wrote in it, "We are here to do great, permanent, and noble things." The last entry of his diary said, "To bed, sick of life." And the point of this was, not only did the peace process not work, all of those people died for nothing. All of the great things about Europe that had been destroyed are now gone for good. And again, you can see it here from Bliss. You can see it from William Bullitt, who quit the Paris Peace Conference because he was so angry. This, in my view, is where the disillusionment comes from. It is the belief that the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference made a future war more likely and meant that all of that destruction, all of those dead, all of those gigantic cemeteries, all of those widows, orphans, disfigured people from the war, all of that was for absolutely nothing. That's, I think, the true meaning of the Treaty of Versailles. It becomes a symbol of that.
A symbol for futility of the First World War, essentially, right?
Correct. And the necessity in the likelihood in many people's minds that you're going to have to deal with this in the future. Mm-hmm. And Tasker Bliss's answer, as you can see it here, is, hey, if it doesn't concern us next time, just stay out of it. Just stay out of it altogether. And that's, of course, what the United States, by and large, did.
Woody, questions?
Peter O'Connell is asking, Paul, my question is, did the First World War ever end?
Oh, thank you for asking that question, because I love having this discussion. I think you can make a perfectly lucid argument that the dynamic of the First World War does not end until the Berlin Wall comes down. I think you can make a perfectly lucid argument that in the Middle East, it hasn't ended yet. I have a friend who likes to call the wars in the Middle East right now the wars of the Ottoman succession. That is, We're still trying to figure out what replaces the Ottoman Empire as a governing entity in that part of the world. I think you can make that argument. So I think it's contextual depending upon where you are. I think 1914 to 1918 is a ridiculously short slice of history for the dynamic that we're talking about here. I think you guys are right to do a series linking these two conflicts because 1914 to 1945 strikes me as just one gigantic dynamic. 1945, the peacemakers at Potsdam are debating the exact same issues they were debating in 1914. What to do with Germany, how to put a world back together, what kind of international organization do you want to have, how do you fix the finances? They're the exact same questions, and everybody knew it. I'm comfortable with the idea of a long war that goes from 1914 to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Not everybody is, but I am perfectly comfortable with that.
I definitely think. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, my thought right now is, had it just been trying to resolve the conflict between Britain, Germany, France, and the US, it would have been complicated enough. But when you throw in, Yugoslavia, Romania, the Baltic states, and everything, it was an impossible task. I mean, it was.
They all come with something that they want, right? They all come in with something that they want. So Romania gains tremendously because it helps put down the Belakun rebellion in Hungary. Everybody gets a piece of something that they want. And, a friend of mine here at the Army War College liked to say that if you want to understand who's going to object to change, look to who is going to lose. And everybody loses somewhere in this treaty. There's something that somebody doesn't get that they want and that they think is existential to their interests. It's a sacred piece of territory that's now on the other side of the border. It's a coal field that's going to help them grow economically. It's whatever it is, right? I mean, Eastern Europe especially is simply too blended together to divide these things up in a way that's going to make any kind of sense for anybody. And I think the longer I'm doing this, it's the Eastern Europe dynamic that is the problem. So that is to say that the Germans are able to say, yes, we have to help rebuild Belgium. We got that. Yes, we're going to lose Alsace and Lorraine. We got that too. But you had no right to take what we conquered in the East away from us. And by the way, you want us strong in the East because the Soviets are your next threat. And they're looking east. They're not looking west.
I'm kind of, the more we're kind of talking about this, the more I'm thinking, actually, you know, this idea that can you have peace if you all have different peace aims? It's like fighting a war if you all have different war aims. You know, it's inevitable that there's going to be problems if you're not all working. You might have the same, maybe one of the same end goal, which is no more war, but actually that things are a whole lot more complicated than that in terms of what that looks like. Everybody's got their ambitions that they are going to want to fulfill in some way or another. And it strikes me that for the Treaty of Versailles itself became a vessel for those ambitions rather than the treaty being the problem.
I think that's right. And I think it also depends. We talk here about the difference between war termination and conflict termination. And there is a paradox here. The Allies could have gotten whatever terms they wanted out of Germany, but that would have required prolonging the war. That would have required going into Germany, going to Berlin, which Foch refused to do in November of 1918. That his point was, I have put the politicians in a position to get what they want from the negotiating table. Anybody that gets killed after that their death is on my head. I've got to stop the war as soon as I think I can do it in a position that puts our people in a position of advantage. By the time the peace conference is over, Foch realizes that the politicians have just flushed this away, which is his comment. He probably said it, though 90% he said it, that this is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Because he recognized you had gotten to war termination, but you hadn't gotten to conflict termination. And in fact, you could argue you've created more seeds of conflict rather than fewer by the time that you're done with this process. So this is the issue that, I mean, you're going to have with Russia and Ukraine when you get to the end of this, hopefully with the Ukrainian victory and hopefully going to the Russians and saying, here's what we want in a peace negotiation. But you have to make sure that you're actually dealing with conflict termination and war termination at the same time. I have no idea how we're going to we as a collective are going to get there, but I think these concepts are important to keep in our heads, that just because the shooting stops on November 11th, 1918, does not mean that the core conflicts have been dealt with. And I know there are people out there talking about imposing a peace on Russia. This is an example of what happens when you impose a peace on one side and the other side is not involved at all. So to me, this feels very modern. Unfortunately, I think Vladimir Putin has done that. Apart from being a great salesman for NATO, he has brought the First World War really back into the way that we think about things. The Economist just had this special report on the future of war. It makes 3 First World War references in it. And I don't think that's the way anybody thought war was going to go. It was going to be cyber and precision and all of this. Instead, as the Economist called it, it's Ypres with AI.
Oh, God. I mean, yeah, I mean, we said when we started this channel, I think pretty much in every talk we've had so far, actually, we have kind of highlighted this idea that this is all very relevant today. Absolutely. And it's terrifying. Like it really is.
And so I'm sorry, go ahead, Lucy. I'm sorry.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, I think the peace process is as irrelevant as anything else. So how do you want to do this? Do you want to do it by a big international peace conference? Do you want to do it by dealing with the symptom, if you will, and try to push the disease out to the far end? Do you want to do this? How do you want to do this? I mean, I had a friend who was asking me about the history of reparations and what historical examples where this worked. And my answer was, short of an occupation, it probably isn't going to work. So it's unreasonable to expect that to be anything more than a rhetorical part of the peace that ends this war. Well, that's not terribly satisfying to a lot of people, and I understand that. But this can give us a lot. This is why I'm asked to speak on this a lot here. I think there's a lot of insight you can get about how you're going to get this war in Ukraine over with and how you're going to get it over with without planting the seeds of conflict in the next 10, 15 years. And the other point, and Woody made it, I think Woody was the one who made it, we're not the only actors in this system. There are a lot of people who have a lot of interest in what's going on, and in some sense, their agency has to be accounted for as well.
I think that brings a good point. Just we've been talking about the micro and the macro of the treaty. Is that someone said early on, Versailles failure, not if it gave your country its very existence. So that's a very narrow point of looking at it. And people living in Alsace, people living in Poland, people living else, they might have had a very different view than our more contextual global view of it there. But another couple of questions we'll deal with. So from John Cratch there, can you argue that 24 to 29 things look as if they were going to work out after all after a rough start?
Yeah, this is why I mean a lot of this is policy choice. I mean, there's a lot of folks who think that by 1928, 29, you've got this thing on a reasonable plane. I mean, even after the Great Depression has started, there are people who think Of course, they don't know it's going to be a 10-year depression, but they think that there's still a way here. You had the Locarno treaties. You had I was just reading in my friend Chad Williams's great book a couple of weeks ago. Even someone as disillusioned and cynical as W.E.B. Du Bois thought that the Locarno treaties were putting Europe back on the right path to peace. So this is what I mean when I say these things are policy choices. I don't think anything is inevitable in the way that this plays itself out. And to your previous point, yes, if you're Czechoslovakia, I mean, the train station is on the Place Woodrow Wilson. That's not a coincidence. On the other hand, you created a situation where it would take a second world war, it would take a Soviet occupation, and then the fall of the Soviet Union for you to truly gain your independence. So it's not an unadulterated good, though it's clearly an important marker in the history of a state like Poland or Czechoslovakia.
Another question from Gregory Dautrep. Please speak of the position of the Western neutral countries. And that's another thing we haven't talked about, though, those that weren't even involved in the conflict, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Well, Belgium was, of course, involved. Belgium was invaded and fought on the Allied side, though they immediately wanted to go back to neutrality in the interwar years, which frustrated the French to no end. This is why the Maginot Line never did get extended all the way north, because it's a political problem. What the French wanted to do was build it with Belgium included. The Belgians did not wish to be included, but if you build it without them included, then they're completely indefensible. There was an interesting discussion during the First World War centenary. I went to one conference, at least in Spain, and one in Holland, which was dedicated to neutrality. And the theme that came across was that there is no such thing as a neutral state in a total war. You see that in the Ukraine situation right now. A country like India, China, Japan, Turkey, Brazil, they're just too powerful or too influential to be truly neutral in the way that they behave, whatever their rhetoric is. And the same thing is kind of happening here. To the best of my knowledge, the Dutch were hoping for a balance of power situation in order to assure that there wouldn't be another war. And of course, part of that was not turning the Kaiser over for war crimes trials, whereas Spain was trying to reorient itself to be slightly more pro-American and slightly pro-Western. And here, Spain is, of course, contingent upon the loss of the 1898 war to the United States. So anti-American feeling had been quite bitter. World War I begins to change that as the Spaniards begin to see that the U.S. can be the market for them that Germany had once been the trade partner. So I think it's different from country to country. Sweden being relatively pro-German, the Spanish being relatively pro-Allied. What they all wanted was to see a system come out of this that would create stability in Europe so everybody could get back to doing what they do.
Great stuff. I'll do two more, then I'll hand it back to Lucy. So, we're reminded that Ho Chi Minh was in Paris in 1919. So that we haven't even got into the Asian effects of the treaty. That's another massive, great rabbit hole that we could spend another week on. But
the whole imperial. There's a wonderful book by my friend Erez Minella called The Wilsonian Moment that is about people in Korea, people in Egypt, reading the words of Woodrow Wilson and believing that they were going to apply to them. And the book is about the disillusion when they realize that the great powers really don't care what happens to them. And Ho Chi Minh has become the symbol of that, of course, famously leaving Paris and going to Moscow and developing a different ideology for how he was going to get what he wanted to get. So yeah, there is a global dimension to this that is really, really powerful and really, really worth looking at.
Japan, that's all I can think of.
Yeah, I do a whole module when I do this at the War College about the Shandong controversy and Japan and the rise of Japan and the way that Japan is neatly able to put the Western countries onto the horns of a real dilemma by pointing out to them that your rhetoric is anti-imperial, but your practice is pro-imperial. So what is it that you really fought this war for? So it has a deep impact on China, of course. It has a deep impact on Egypt. It has a deep impact on India. It's a world war that again, I think its dynamic doesn't really end until at least 1989. And I'm going to Israel in a couple of weeks here, the Middle East in a couple of weeks. I mean, last time I did this trip with this group, we went to the Golan Heights and the person pulled out a Sykes-Picot map to start us. That there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that.
So, I mean, my last question, I'll let Lucy wrap things up, is if you're studying leadership in wars. Whether you're in whichever part of the world you are, you can identify certain qualities about leaders. This one is good, this one is bad, or although it's never quite that neat. But when you're studying something like the Treaty of Versailles, wherever you're studying it from, whichever country you're in, the country you're living in has had some kind of vested interest in this and came out of the treaty better or worse. So for the people who are watching this, and this is really their first sort of delving into the Treaty of Versailles, as a subject, how can you study it and learn it without somehow taking sides?
So I think the way I want to answer that, we talk about, I teach Army colonels here, and what we talk about is we want our people to think up and out. And what we mean by that is we want them to think about the way that the actions of them personally and their institutions, the way they're affecting people above them and out into the system. So in other words, we don't want them thinking in and down, right? So don't think about how this is going to affect the job you just left, but how's this going to affect your boss's boss, and the international system? The people who did that most effectively, whose work I've read, realized this system is never going to work. It's John Maynard Keynes who could see up and out. It's Tasker Bliss who could see up and out. This is just never going to work. So I think one of the lessons is you have to be able to see beyond your own narrow interest. That doesn't mean you stop pursuing them, but there's no way that it's going to work long term unless your interest can fit into a wider system. I also think the other lesson, to come back to something I said earlier, if the world is dynamic, do not try to govern it from a static document, because it just isn't going to work. And the idea that the League of Nations would somehow become the adjudicating body of this, that was never going to do what they hoped that it was going to do. So I think most leaders in this, I personally read most of these leaders as just being completely overwhelmed. And there are anecdotes, whether they're apocryphal or whether they're true, about looking at lines on maps and having no idea that that river is actually an international border, or, just being completely clueless. People like Wilson, who is deciding the fate of places he'd never seen, had never heard of. So, yeah, I mean, maybe it's an argument for solving small problems first. Maybe that's really what the argument is, that trying to grand theories that will solve everything are unlikely to work, but dealing with pragmatic problems on the ground may be the way to do it.
I think that's what I've got from you, Mike, and my understanding of the Treaty of Versailles from tonight is actually that it's not so often as historians we're faced with questions and people expect a black and white answer. Did the Treaty of Versailles cause the Second World War? Yes or no? And actually, the more we're doing this, the more we're chatting, the more actually it's this understanding that this is nuance, and you can view history through the lens of things like the Treaty of Versailles to gain a better understanding of events. But it's not about pinpointing one particular thing that caused it, because actually the world doesn't work like that. People don't work like that. And I guess as we kind of bring this to a close, my question to you is, when people think about the Treaty of Versailles, and Woody's mentioned there about the best ways to study it or to look at it, for you, what is the legacy of it when it comes to the Second World War? Is it just that it was this vessel for things, or is it actually more about understanding how leadership works and how to really find peace, I guess, and that actually this wasn't a good idea?
I think it's all of those things, really, which is why it's kind of fascinating to me to think about it. It is a question about how to rebuild something that is broken. It is a question about what do you do once you've signed a crappy treaty? How do you kind of back your way out of it? And appeasement is the original idea about how you're going to do that. How do you get that what we call strategic empathy, where you try to understand how other people are going to read this? I mean, I've had these, they're discussions in a bar, not a classroom. But if you just didn't put the war guilt treaty in, the war guilt clause in, would this go differently? That is, could you have enforced a treaty that wasn't intentionally insulting, especially to a group of Germans that had nothing to do with causing the outbreak of the war, right? The people that caused the outbreak of the war, the Kaisers in Holland, Moltke is dead, right? I mean, the people that actually made this decision are all gone. It doesn't make sense to punish the next generation. So there are ways in which you can envision a treaty that would at least have been better. Would that have been good enough? I don't think so. I also think we need to understand that just because you say a war is over, it doesn't mean it's over. So we can say that the war in Ukraine is over tomorrow if certain military conditions apply. It doesn't mean that that's going to be the accepted thing. So I don't think I answered your question, but your point about it being very, very complicated and multifaceted and allowing you to examine things through a number of different lenses is exactly spot on. There is no magic equation that history gives, which is what causes the problem for policymakers. That's what they're looking for. And that's what leads to these grand unifying theories of history. When all of us who do this for a living know it's about context, it's about contingency, it's about all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's about the human condition as well, right? Which is something that, if there's a magic bullet and an answer to these things, then, hallelujah. But we're yet to find it, right? I think we have to wrap things up. Been absolutely incredible, Michael. I hope that you'll come back and join us again, because I think, this is a topic that we're going to have to be coming back to. I think personally, the interwar period as well is something that we need to do much more scholarship on, have a much greater understanding on. I think it's been something that's kind of brushed over in the past. And so, this is the whole point of this channel, right? Is that we're kind of trying to look into these things in a bit more detail. So yeah, thank you very much, Michael. Any final thoughts from you on Versailles, or? Just
to echo what you just said, I think we as a group of historians for a long time have underplayed the interwar years, reduced it to simplicity, and we need to go back as a group of scholars and really dig into it and really, really study it, because I don't think as a group, as a community of historians, we've done it nearly as well as we need to.
Yeah, 100%.
And my final point is, because Lucy sometimes forgets to do it, is don't forget we now have YouTube membership available. So we've got about 7 or 8 members during with the stream today, so that's fantastic. So please consider doing that. Share it on social media. I, of course, the link to Michael's book on the Treaty of Versailles is in the link description below. But as I can understand from Michael talking today, it's one of those subjects that I'm sure your thinking on it is changing like it was in 1919, almost week by week with the world situation. I can't see it's a project you've gone, yeah, done that one now.
Yeah, right. Sadly, no.
Yeah.
Sadly,
well,
no.
Lucy, take us out then.
Yeah. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for the new members that have joined us as well during this talk. And we hope to see you again soon. We'll be back with news on the next round of our shows. So, yeah, stay tuned. Take care.